bears with bongs was an entertaining concept, and we're like, okay, we'll run with it. Oh, totally bearish. That's cooked. Berachain and the idea of proof of liquidity, I'd say, came about from this second thing that proof of liquidity was really meant to do. Chains are ultimately the sum of the applications that are built on top of them. One of the things that the space lacks the most is real human capital. Every shitcoin was going to end up being the future of finance. A lot of crypto wants to feel like nouveau riche. I think that we were just like, this is entertaining, and we will simply double down on it.
Hello and welcome to Blockchain Bylines. My name is Nicholas Carey, co-founder and vice chairman of Blockchain.com. For this monthly Bylines episode, we're excited to host Smokey, co-founder of Berachain. Now, Berachain is an innovative layer one that has been gaining attention for its novel approach to consensus mechanisms, DeFi incentives, and its unique culture-driven community. Built on a proof of liquidity consensus model, Berachain seeks to drive sustainable growth within the DeFi ecosystem while maintaining a strong and engaged user base. Now, I'm sure Smokey can give us a lot more color on this. So without further ado, let's jump into this month's byline. This is a little bit of a ritual here, but we got to ask you, how did you get into crypto?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me. I'd say that started in about 2015/2016. Had spent a long time in and out of the Bay Area while building my first company in the healthcare/biotech and drug discovery space. If you were in the Bay at that time, you probably found yourselves running into some of the earlier players in the crypto scene. For me, that was effectively having one of my earlier investors being fairly senior at the ETH Foundation, and then seeing a lot of smart friends starting to explore things in crypto who might have previously been working on things in hard tech or enterprise SaaS or anything at the intersection of the such. So I think it was a little bit of like dipping toes just because there was enough adjacency around me to give it a shot. And that was just buying ETH and Bitcoin. And then I think I've always considered myself like a relatively risk-on guy. So then I spent a lot more time messing around in 2017 and 2018 and thinking that every shitcoin was going to end up being the future of finance for a brief period of time. So, played my time around Dragon Chain and Rayblock/Nano and VeChain and every other narrative that's supposedly coming back in some way now. So I guess perhaps you were early. Then DeFi Summers or DeFi Summer Round 2, NFTs, all things that ended up drawing me back over time.
Very cool. Well, I need to learn the backstory here from Blong Bears to mainlet launch, Berachain. Give us some of the founding sort of elements, story, personalities. I want to hear about this start.
Yeah, I think that Berachain started more or less by accident in that we had been spending a lot of time in these very DeFi native discords. So think your Olympus, Frax, Alchemix type servers where you had a lot of folks who were very interested in new things being built within crypto and DeFi, but were also fairly risk-on, fairly lackadaisical in the middle of a relatively aggressive bull, prompted by, COVID, stimmies, et cetera. And I think that with that, we saw ourselves also, I think, messing around a little bit in different NFT ecosystems, which are really seeing a lot of growth in that 2021 timeframe, especially as NFTs were evolving from pictures of monkeys to things with more utility and these sort of like trading card games and value accruing NFTs, et cetera, that might represent tokenized shares in X or Y platform. So with that, we thought it could be kind of cool to just explore an NFT project without a particular end game in mind. So my co-founder Papa and I basically, he whipped up a number of NFTs of bears, and we raffled those off across a whole bunch of these Discord communities at a very mimetically fitting price, perhaps of 0.069 ETH. And then had those become relatively popular amongst a small group of people. And from there it was like, okay, now what? And I think that we sort of had two choices. One was sort of lean into the NFT side even more and just say, okay, we're going to make a 10,000, 10K profile picture collection, Bored Ape style. Or we could have taken the approach which we did, which is to say, let's see if we can embed some interesting mechanics into this whole system. So the whole approach at that point was actually to see if we could find a way to build something that hadn't really been done before and find a way to make the NFTs a little more interesting than average. So we actually decided to make these NFTs like rebase or multiply in supply. This is noting that a lot of that holder base, that initial population, were also quite emblematic of early DeFi communities in that they weren't people who were solely interested in NFTs. They were also quite interested in just interesting game theory that could be explored on chain. So the way that this worked was that if you held one of the initial bear collections, then as more collections released, you effectively had a share of those collections. So if you had one bear from the first collection, then you get one bear for free in the second collection. If you had those two bears, you'd get two bears in the third collection. So people could effectively increase their stack of bears, if you will, over time for having participated earlier while the supply effectively became less scarce and more distributed over time, which is sort of how we went from a group of 100-ish people holding these NFTs to start to a community of thousands of folks.
Do you know what a plural noun for bears is?
Oh my God, isn't it a sleuth?
It's
A sleuth of bears? Yeah.
That was going to be your big test today. Awesome.
Of course.
Okay, so that's a really cool story. I like the fusion between the tech, the culture, science, and then a bit of like humor in all of it. But you guys have really come up the technology, I would say, and utility side of all of this, starting from more cultural point of view. But like, talk to us a little bit about the proof of liquidity model, how that differs from proof of stake. We need a little bit of a crash course here.
Yeah, certainly. Maybe I'll start with proof of stake. Proof of stake is probably what we know best from ecosystems like Ethereum, and is perhaps the most tried and true consensus model after your proof of work a la Bitcoin systems, right? And in proof of stake, users are basically putting capital at risk and or stake to secure the network. And these different groups or validators or nodes across the network are saying that, hey, if I effectively attest to something that is untrue, then I may be slashed or I might have my capital reduced for misbehaving, if you will. But the idea is that the capital sits within these validators, these groups that are securing the network, which you can think of as sort of like cloud computing nodes. And the network consists of this entire group of validators saying yes or no, this happened, this didn't happen. And in this process, blocks are being produced on the network. And that's sort of this idea of block rewards, incentives, inflation, which is what keeps chains going around, and which is what actually makes it economically feasible for a validator to continue sustaining itself and for a network to stay afloat. So Ethereum has a set of thousands of validators, which are each people or protocols taking 32 ETH apiece, which will also evolve over time, and then earning block rewards or inflationary incentives in the form of Ethereum. So that's like, the most baseline system. And what's interesting here is that the majority of value accrues to the validator itself. As in, as the chain progresses, that money, those funds are going towards the validators who are keeping this ecosystem afloat. In other chains, perhaps Cosmos ecosystems, some of the Miston chains, et cetera, you have something closer to delegated proof of stake, in which, as opposed to every validator staking the exact same amount, there's a perhaps limited set of validators as a result of different consensus mechanisms, et cetera. And I should say proof of stake isn't a consensus mechanism as much as the Sybil resistance mechanism. And that's just sort of getting into the weeds, but basically those can be two slightly different concepts. In the case of delegated proof of stake, you can have people putting all sorts of different amounts of tokens on different validators. So one validator can have 1 million tokens, another validator can have 100,000 tokens. And the validators with more tokens produce more block rewards and make more, money / earn more incentives. And then, of course, distribute some portion of that towards their delegates or the people that gave them those tokens after taking a small commission. However, in both of these systems, the value accrual basically goes towards the validators and the people locking up idle capital to secure a network. And I think that this is sensible as a baseline. However, if we ever expect blockchains to scale and turn into tools that are used in day-to-day life and that power applications and things that we use, in a practical world, the validators are not really what makes the world go round. The validators 100% keep the network afloat and secure its belongings, but there has to be an application layer on top of blockchains. So when you think about the Ethereum application layer, you can think about stuff like OpenSea, which is very popular as an NFT trading marketplace, and perhaps many viewers might be, familiar with from that 2021 to 2023 timeframe. You might think about Uniswap or Aave or Lido, which are different applications which allow you to swap tokens or borrow and supply tokens in a lending market or stake tokens, etc. And I think that chains are often best thought of as operating systems with all these different applications on top of them. However, if at the end of the day, value needs to accrue to the applications in order for users to flow into a network and for a chain to be useful, it seemed incredibly anti-sensical or illogical to us that chains were structured to drive value to the folks that were not necessarily actually contributing the most actively towards their growth. And this isn't to pass a blanket statement, and that, some validators are very active proponents in governance, or they build applications themselves, or they might build tooling for an ecosystem. But I think it's also very fair to say that there's a highly extractive class of validators that also exists that sort of sets and forgets and perhaps brings a brand name to an ecosystem and then sells block rewards and disappears off into the sunset. So Berachain and the idea of proof of liquidity, I'd say, came about from a couple of different internal theses. One was after observing a lot of these chains in the 2021, 2022 timeframe, many of them would have hundreds of millions or billions of dollars effectively sitting idle in a validator set, while they had a fraction of that, let's say $5 to $10 million, actually being utilized and traded through on the chain. We thought that made very little sense. Passive capital not really accomplishing much, and also something which network stakeholders are paying for. If that chain has a $3 billion FDV and 10% inflation, then you're printing $300 million to secure $10 million. What are you doing, right? Your cost of security is greatly outweighed, or is, completely ridiculous. So the concept of proof of liquidity was one that was effectively meant to better align incentives between liquidity and security at the network level. I'd say the second thing that proof of liquidity was really meant to do, and I think that this is what we see as even perhaps more on trend in the current market, as I think that people have sort of started caring a lot less consciously about security and have started caring a lot more consciously as to what's being built on different chains, is that very few applications had a mechanistic reason, if you will, to exist on chain A versus chain B. In that, why do you live on Solana versus AVAX versus Harmony versus Near versus Phantom or Sonic or whatever it might be? In many cases, for some time, that was just whoever threw the most grants at you, or whichever chain might have, some gap in their ecosystem that you could come and fill. But now in many cases, a lot of these things are table stakes. And the best applications, I think in most cases, smart enough to know that if a chain has to give them a grant to acquire them, then that chain probably isn't very good and is failing in some manner, whether it be, capital acquisition, distribution, etc. The whole idea that we found ourselves chasing was, is there a way that the chain itself can empower the applications that are living on top of it in a meaningfully opinionated manner? And that's sort of the second tenet of proof of liquidity, if you will. But the way to think about this is that Berachain and proof of liquidity effectively flips inflation or block rewards or the value flows of a blockchain or a typical proof of stake chain on their heads. In that, as opposed to value going from the chain to the validators and the validators to their delegates / stakers, let's say, who are locking up idle capital, the chain is actually, in the case of Berachain, having the validators emit tokens or inflation or block rewards to the applications, and in turn from those applications to their users who are providing active capital. So more than anything else, the chain is rewarding network activity, economic stimulus, and it's a activity that is geared towards growth and actually giving the opportunity for the validators and those who are providing security on the network to help influence where liquidity flows. And I think that's perhaps what makes Berachain most interesting. The way this is actually accomplished is sort of via a slightly more complex multi-tiered system of sorts.
Yeah, thank you for that really in-depth overview. I think one of the most interesting things about crypto is just how it promotes all of these variable incentive models, and they kind of learn from each other and they keep getting better. And that's, I think, one of the things you guys have done in a very clever way is basically weave all of that together. Now, let's talk a little bit about the sort of underpinning economic units within the Berachain ecosystem. So I know we've got a few different tokenomics to cover off here, and the interactions between them are pretty distinctive. So if you could dig into Honey, BGT, and Bera specifically, that'd be great.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll give quite quick overviews of each of them. So Bera is the staking / gas token of the network. This is the most basic form of security. So for context, Berachain has close to $3 billion of capital living on the network. And of course, at launch, you need to make sure that there's something there that helps secure that capital such that it is safe and sustainable on that ecosystem. So Berachain actually basically uses a form of staking, or a basic form of staking in terms of security that's quite similar to what ETH will look like in the near future after upgrades. There's a concept called max EB that's coming into play that will allow validators to stake, between 32 and 2048 Bera. And in the case of Berachain, one can stake anywhere between 250K and 10 million Bera in order to be a validator on the chain. And the amount of blocks produced is based on the amount of Bera that a user has. However, where it gets a little bit more interesting and where the system, I think, increases and becomes more proof of liquidity-esque is that each validator has two components. One is their Bera stake, which determines how many blocks they produce. The second is their BGT boost or BGT delegation, which determines the size of their block rewards. And validators basically BGT can be earned in two ways. To start, it is the illiquid and non-transferable rewards token of the network. So all emissions are in the form of BGT, not Bera. Notably, BGT stands for the Bera governance token, and it is primarily earned via providing liquidity or staking tokens. Sorry, I should say providing liquidity to tokens that are eligible for proof of liquidity. So what that means is that there are a number of different venues across the chain, primarily those that look like liquidity pools, but can really evolve over time into a number of different vault tokens, single-sided deposits, etc., which allow people to earn BGT. So as the chain rolled out, and in the initial stages of proof of liquidity, this is sort of very guardrailed or basic and took the form of basically deposits in the chain DEX, aptly named the BEX, so that users could provide liquidity in the form of Berachain LPs, etc., across a few different pairs and earn their BGT. The BGT can then be delegated to a validator and used to boost its block rewards, and that way that validator produces larger blocks / more rewards effectively. And the last thing to keep in mind there is that at any point in time, BGT can be burned one way into Bera. So the way to effectively earn the governance or the influence token of the network that gives people a say in its direction over time is via liquidity provision, whereas the way to determine how many blocks you're producing with a very small base fee or base earning rate is via having the Bera token. So I think it's quite important to keep in mind that it's almost like a two-factor set of validator earnings. So when one looks at all of the emissions on the chain level, the vast majority is going towards people that are participating in proof of liquidity and providing liquidity. And, like some 10, 15% of those emissions are going towards the validator set. So compared to a typical proof of stake chain that might have anywhere between 5 and 20% APY towards just validators who are staking the token, on Berachain, that's closer to 2%, whereas the vast majority of those block rewards are going towards the LPs in the system. Then finally, there's Honey. Honey is quite simple. It's sort of the stablecoin of the Berachain ecosystem. It is meant to be as vanilla / standard as possible, and meant more than anything else to help defragment, I'd say, well-backed, stable, centralized for the most part collateral across the Berachain ecosystem. It is only backed by USDC and PayPal USD. The fun fact there is that Berachain is actually the largest supply of PayPal USD outside of Ethereum mainnet where it's minted and originated. So there's, close to $200 million of PYUSD living on Berachain at the moment.
Very cool. Okay, I don't think I knew that. All right, so just in summary, we've got basically Bera, which is the gas utility token, BGT, which is the governance token, and then Honey, which is a stable coin. So I think there's a very interesting sort of balance of power between economics, the incentives, and where the rewards are going, and it's quite thoughtfully done. Let's talk a little bit about, to take a perspective maybe from you on how Berachain can evolve in this big multi-chain landscape we're inheriting now.
Yeah, I mean, there's it's a pretty loaded one to unpack, so I could probably hit it from a couple different angles. I think that the biggest thing to keep in mind is that chains are ultimately the sum of the applications that are built on top of them, right? And I think that one can look at that in a couple different manners. On one hand, there's simply just what is the capital efficiency? Are there trades or are there profitable moves that can be made on a given network from the capital base and the applications that exist there in their architecture that one cannot make anywhere else? There's something to be said about culture and distribution in terms of, is there a way that this chain allows you to reach a subset of users or reach a certain GDP that one typically does not have access to? And then is there something that from a tokenomics or value accrual perspective that makes it interesting? And I think there's a few different angles to each of these for us. On one hand, I think Berachain is always very much focused on prioritizing 0-to-1 applications. We don't care for the next Aave fork, the next Uni fork, the copy and paste is something that you see in 5 other ecosystems. We care more a lot about things that you haven't seen before and how they can be given the best spotlight. At the same time, when one actually looks at the tokenomics of Berachain, which really do play a role in driving values of the application layer, it's worth noting that BGT is really the only L1 token in existence that actually drives its yield or accrues its value from exogenous applications living on the chain as well. And to go into that for a second, right? Typically, when you're looking at a proof of stake chain, you're saying, okay, my ETH or my SOL is being used at this rate, and as a result of the burn, this is its value because it's going to continue decreasing in supply over time. And I think we've seen a number of different ways towards understanding that, and a number of different changes to this thesis over time as L2s and DA and blobs and all this sorts of stuff rolls out and plays different roles in the ETH or SOL value accrual thesis for that matter. And even in the example of SOL, there was recently a large vote / back and forth with the validators around cutting inflation that was quite contentious and changing the economic models of the ecosystem. In contrast, going back to the point about BGT and why it's an interesting token, is that BGT is what is used to determine where incentives flow across the chain, as in, are they going towards pool A on the DEX? Are they going towards pool B on the lending market? Are they going towards, Vault C for a, more abstract derivatives protocol? They are the voting token in the network that allows you to have the choice as to where things go. And in order for users to be rewarded for holding that voting token, they're actually able to basically delegate those tokens to different validators who in turn can choose to point their emissions towards different pools in the network in exchange for incentives. So it effectively means that as a protocol is looking to get off the ground, to acquire users, to bootstrap their own liquidity or activity, they can turn to a validator and say, hey, I have $1 of my token. I'd like to get 1 BGT in exchange for this. Or I'd like to find a way to establish this rate. And as the network starts, we expect that to be very capital efficient for applications because they might be able to put out $1 in emissions and get $10 of BGT back. But that $1 in emissions is actually going back towards the BGT holders and the validator set and their delegates, which means that value is actually being passed back to the people who are playing the most important role of liquidity provision within the chain. So we think that that gets really interesting over time because it means that you can actually value BGT and by proxy Bera and a lot of the ecosystem in a manner that isn't just dependent on how much Bera is being burnt from gas and activity, but rather by how much people are willing to pay to actually receive BGT. And for applications, that becomes very interesting because you can say, hey, I'm going to pay $1 and for that, I'm going to get $6 of emissions. And for that $6 of emissions, perhaps I can obtain $100 worth of liquidity. And for that $100 of liquidity, perhaps I can generate $1 worth of fees and start that cycle over again, right? And that becomes quite interesting for applications that are looking to scale and cross that chasm or valley of death, if you will.
Yeah, it's a super interesting bootstrapping mechanism. Very, very cool. So Berachain is moving from phase 0 to phase 1. Can you talk about what that entails?
Yeah, the biggest thing there is that, as I mentioned, right, to start, the vast majority of those emissions on the proof of liquidity side and BGT, we're going towards these 5 pools on the DEX, right? The chain native DEX that was built in from day one. And the vast majority of the yields on BGT are coming from people who are trading on the BEX. Those fees on the BEX are going back towards BGT delegates. What happens next is basically that validators who actually determine where emissions go across the network will be able to direct their emissions towards pools, vaults, whatever you like to call them, sources of liquidity that are not just those 5 BEX pools. So there'll be a group of 20 plus different liquidity venues across different applications that will be approved as destinations where validators can point their BGT emissions. And what gets quite interesting there is that these different vaults, these different eligible POL destinations, or as we call them, reward vault, will have different incentives on them that will actually be going towards validators and, more importantly, their BGT boosters and delegates. So what this really marks is, I'd say, the opening up of POL and the point at which the chain can start very meaningfully and tangibly supporting and driving value to its full application set as opposed to just sort of the initial sandbox version. So it means that to start, if you're another DEX in the ecosystem, there'll be a way to have emissions directed towards your pools. But it could be supply side on a lending market that starts a great looping flywheel that allows people to supply, borrow, rinse and repeat. It could be used to get sort of activation energy on, I'd say, a more abstract derivatives type of protocol that requires a lot of flow of liquidity, sort of perhaps an initial amount of deposits to get an efficient program off the ground for arbitrage. So with that kind of thing, it really means that BGT starts working for the ecosystem as a whole, as opposed to a subset of it. And we think that gets very exciting.
So our listeners know that you are very active on Twitter under the handle Smokey the Bera. And I wanted to ask you about a tweet you had the other day. You said, when they zig, we zag. Your founder is talking about tokenizing T-bills and how they're now institutional. I'm talking about real world animals, real world energy, and real world ammo, Berachain. Do you mean with crypto going institutional, or are we trying to keep the revolution alive? What is it?
No, not at all, actually. I think it's more that I'm deeply entertained by like the erratic nature of narratives within crypto, and that it's very easy to just like grift across 20 different sectors in accordance to the flavor of the month and say, yes, right now we're ZK. Now we are modular. Now we're restaking. And now we're RWAs. And now we're institutional. And I think I've seen a lot of teams sort of take that whiplash roller coaster. And look, sometimes it's done quite masterfully, and it's great from a chart management and or sentiment management point of view. And it's like, yes, this founder is such a luminary. They're so ahead of the game. They're smacking every narrative on the head. Other times it ends up just being a big nothing burger. And I think that one of the things that we may have done, I think we've generally done a pretty good job of is staying the course, and perhaps to a fault, right? Maybe we have not finessed hard enough, but I'd much rather be able to say, hey, this is what we set out to do. And here's the metrics that we think matter for that. And here's how we end up owning that. And for that, it's, it's driving value to proof of liquidity. It's making that concept well known and real. And I think we're very much starting to see other chains and other protocols start to adopt this concept after we came up with it a little while ago, whether that is Initia's vested interest program, whether that's Corin's gauges, whether that's some of the work that Mode did in the past around sort of like VE adjacent systems, whether that is a whole bunch of different sort of fee accrual / value accrual mechanisms that I think are putting value back in the hands of applications. Yeah, so my beef is not with institutional. In fact, I think that a lot of us within Berachain, myself included, have been much more formal in a past life, and are probably by default more comfortable dealing with institutions than some of the hordes on crypto, Twitter, etc. I think that it's actually more of like a pick a lane, guys, and not every chain, ourselves included, is some massive institutional target. But hopefully many different groups will find their ways into a narrative that is, I think, both intellectually honest and palatable for real world / TradFi capital, because if we don't manage to actually bring that into crypto, we'll have probably failed quite meaningfully as an industry.
Yep. Yeah, it's about building a big tent, right? Let's talk a bit about that. I mean, community has been at the real core of Berachain's founding, and you've kind of captured a bit of that, like meme culture. How do you describe meme culture to non-internet native people, and how do you explain how valuable it is to have this dedicated fan base that basically comes along with you, and then layering that into the brand, into the product offering, into future feature sets, et cetera?
I think it's tough to put an exact finger on the best framing there, but I guess that in the same way that we're very much moving into an attention economy in the quote unquote real world or the world of Web 2, et cetera, and we see these sort of like content marketers and influencers of sorts and accompanying platforms, whether that be Real, TikTok, et cetera, take a life of their own. In many cases, I think the trends that permeate to everyday society start within these walls, right? They start somewhere on Twitter or Reddit or 4chan or Instagram, and then find their way out to the real world, if you will. And often are the cases of massive businesses being built around them. Stuff as ridiculous as Skibbity Toilet, ends up being bought by incredibly influential people in the film industry, and franchises are built around this. But people don't think of that as much, right? I think it's almost a dichotomy if you have your 14-year-olds who want to be a TikTok star, and then you have the people sort of lambasting this concept on the internet. So I think having a mimetic culture is one that perhaps leans into some, crypto's core ideals, in my opinion, in that there's a fair bit of openness and expression. There's a fair bit of tolerance for anonymity, et cetera. I think very like meritocratic and ideals first, despite still being quite a messy, dark forest at its core. And I think that what it sort of allows you to do is to attract folks that sit on a little bit around at the edges of the horseshoe, in that you have the deep left curve who are yelling about how every XRP is backed by gold, and how like Cardano smart contracts are the future of finance. But at the same time, you have the folks who are thinking about things from a deeply analytical and first principles point of view. I think it allows you to have fun while maintaining competence. And I think that that's sort of what we've tried to lean into more than anything else. At times you go too far left, at times you go too far right. But I think that what we've tried to basically establish is our own brand that has the right degree of playfulness for distribution and competence to see it through, right? I think what almost parallels in some cases as we think about stuff like Liquid Death, or like the mischief type things where they have these drops, they drum up this attention. The product and the brand itself is elegant, but also simple enough. But it's a topic that we spend a lot of time thinking about internally as well, because there isn't a perfect proxy.
I want to ask you one more question. Tell us a bit about Bear Baddies and Build a Bear.
For sure. Two very different but equally interesting initiatives, I think. On one hand, Bear Baddies was basically an initiative that was formed by one of our community members, who was actually like one of the first people in our Discord 3+ years ago. And she was one of few girls in the space. And I think that there's very few like safe or desirable places for women within crypto. I think that crypto is by default a pretty like toxic, misogynistic environment at times. And that can definitely get tough, I think, as you're trying to expand. Also, just objectively thinking about this, like women are so much of spending power. Women are large consumers of games like match 3s, match 4s, et cetera. Women matter in a market. And I think that to date, there have been different programs that try to onboard them into crypto, but I think they've had varying degrees of corniness. And this is the opinion that I've had myself and that I've seen from talking to friends in the space. And so like they haven't always created a community that to the best of my understanding, speaking as an entitled male, that girls actually want to be part of. I think the Bera baddies tried to strike a little bit of a lens in between, where on one hand, they're a little bit of education, a little bit of understanding of like, hey, here's, cool stuff that you can do on chain. But also just like girls having fun and throwing events and nail bars and get ready with me days and that kind of stuff. So I think they've very much been like a community initiative, and has basically just become like a safe/fun space for girls within crypto. And I'd say they're getting increasingly interesting and increasingly technical in that they're starting to do more on chain. They're starting to like try to run their own validators and stuff like that. They're finding different employment opportunities for girls within the industry. And I think a lot of that has been built around the Berachain ecosystem. And that group is now like, I think 700 or 800 strong, which is like not ridiculous, but pretty meaningful. What do you think about the total number of girls who are actively engaged in crypto? So yeah, man. And then the other side, Build-A-Vera, is sort of an opinionated but arm's length program from the foundation that's meant to be sort of our answer to YC, et cetera, in terms of taking fairly opinionated bets on things that we believe would either be deeply important core primitives within the Berachain ecosystem or just weird 0 to 1 shit. So, stuff like real world animals is actually a company called Stablehold that's looking at tokenizing horse racing and horse breeding on chain, which I think is like way more interesting because horse racing, cool, that's like coin flips. But horse breeding is a deeply profitable industry if done properly. And also one that appeals to interesting subsectors because a lot of crypto wants to feel like nouveau riche, right? And what's more old money than horse betting, horse breeding, etc.? Not too many things. So, in short, Build-A-Bear is there to take bets and to help give founders as much support on go-to-market as possible for weird, cool, new shit at the very earliest stages.
A lot of people don't know this, but most horses are basically owned by syndicates, aka fractional ownership, and they share in the winnings out of a horse race. That's super cool. All right. Well, pardon the pun, but thanks for bearing with us. I'm going to hand it off here to Zara. She's got kind of a lightning round for you. And so I'll give her the hot mic now.
Hey, Smokey. Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming on the show. I just have a few questions for you coming from the less technical side of the coin.
Hit me.
Just starting with, why did you decide to be anonymous? Because I think there are a lot of people who are non-native that maybe look at it and see it as mysterious.
It's weird. For sure. And like, that's a fair perspective. So I think a couple different things from a few different angles. One is that when we started building in the space, I think that some of the smartest builders I know are folks who are anonymous and were anonymous in the past, but actually, are living pretty sophisticated lives in traditional finance or in tech, et cetera. And these guys can effectively run circles around the majority of natives just from like a competence point of view as a result of more rigorous experience, more discipline, more skin in the game. They're also very, very competent natives, but there are a lot of folks who we knew, especially those with families, those living in the US prior to more, I'd say, friendly regulatory regimes as of late, who were spending 2 to 3 hours a day clocking into their FANG day job and spending the rest of their time in the trenches on chain. And I think that actually providing a bit of an opportunity for those folks to break out and slowly make their ways deeper into crypto is quite important for us, because I think it was something relatable. And I think that one of the things that the space lacks the most is real human capital. And there is, I think, a very fair argument to be said for regulatory risk, which is thankfully seemingly fading a little bit, so that more and more folks can actually start jumping in headfirst. That's one thing. Another thing is that I think we do believe in crypto native ideals around meritocracy and letting our work and our actions speak for themselves. I think that it's easy to do scammy shit in this space. I think it's a lot easier to do scammy shit if you rest on your laurels of previous experience. And two was like, I think that there's something to be said about just like letting your actions speak, right? So cared about that a lot. 3 was also just like safety. I think that crypto is a pretty messy space as well. And we know a non-trivial number of folks that have done quite well financially and then ended up targeted or had their friends and families targeted as a result of this. So, with that being said, there's lots of folks who know us. We are docs to our lead investors, et cetera. We're out and about at conferences and whatnot, but we don't see much benefit in being publicly visible in that same way because I think it's just a lot of unwanted attention.
So what's that like for your day-to-day life? For example, like if you meet someone new, they ask, what do you do for a living? How does that work?
It's honestly pretty funny. And, I'll talk to my girlfriend or her friends about this and tell them to be careful every now and then. I'm just like, oh yeah, like I work in tech. I mean, I don't not work in tech. And I think that it's kind of entertaining enough to make that the standard tech bro answer. And I just more or less try to play it down.
Smokey, you got
And
to use
then,
my line. I work in e-commerce. That
yeah,
always.
we're gonna I've said fintech before. I think that one's been relatively well received as well.
Okay, so now we're going to play a quick game. I'm going to give you a couple popular topics, and I want you to tell us if you're bullish or bearish on them.
Sure.
AI agents.
Mostly bearish. Mostly bearish just because I think there's a lot of fluff out there. I do think that there will be a few use cases that are very powerful, but 95 to 5% bearish.
NFTs, bullish or bearish?
Ooh, that's another. I think same thing in that 95 to 5% bearish, but probably 5% bullish because they are a very strong community building tool, and we'll probably see more around value accruing NFTs in the near future from a reg standpoint.
The metaverse, bullish or bearish?
Oh, totally bearish. It's cooked.
Why is it cooked?
I mean, I just think that the metaverse had such an overexposure and an overbelief a few years ago that it's nearly impossible to re-anchor to those expectations. And I think that becomes very tough to undo inertialize. And the fact is, I think most people realize that they don't care to live in the metaverse. I mean, the internet isn't already enough of a metaverse. Why add another layer to this, if you will? So the whole metaverse real estate, metaverse X or Y, it just kind of fell off. I think there was also some degree of overlap with belief in VR and that playing, a deeper role in this fully immersive experience, some Ready Player One type of thing. And I don't think that really panned out either.
Meme coins, bullish or bearish?
I think that I'm a coin flip. I'm probably 50-50 on meme coins because I think that there was a lot extracted in a negative sense this cycle via meme coins and insider pump and dumps, etc. And they became a tool for grifting. But I also do think that they're one of the only things that has product market fit from a crypto user perspective at the moment or at the stage of maturity that we're at.
Do you have a favorite meme?
In general, I think I got a lot of appreciation for the Q5 meme because the whole idea of we joked a lot about shipping in Q5 and sort of made that a thing for a little while because we kept on missing engineering timelines at one point. And I was like, fuck, I'm done promising dates. I'm just going to, say that it's Q5 and people can make of that what they wish. And then I also realized it's a little bit of a thing in the real world, more than I had realized at first, and that just more of a running joke at times. You'll catch someone at an office party and be like, "Oh, we'll figure it out in Q5 after the holidays." So I've come to appreciate that a lot because it solved a problem for me or allowed us to weaponize the fact that we were attempting something very technically difficult. It allowed us to turn a negative into a bit of a positive.
Bullish or bearish crypto ETFs?
Bearish. I think that most crypto ETFs have lost a lot of their signal and now are just more or less this happened. And I think that the bar is going down and I'm increasingly confused as to who is buying these ETFs beyond the foundations themselves, seeding that liquidity. That being said, I do believe that in the long tail, they will be bullish. And I think that the next year or so, they're probably kind of useless in many cases. And then, for example, ETF inflows are quite underwhelming. But I do think that long run, they are bullish as more trad allocators find ways to get exposure to crypto.
You kind of touched on it a little bit at the beginning when we were talking about the NFT, but you didn't really give us the lore. Why bears? Why bongs?
It's funny, none of us even smoke. We just thought it was funny. We just really thought that the concept was entertaining. There wasn't a deep reason for it. And then there wasn't some master plan. We just thought the bears with bongs was an entertaining concept and we're like, okay, we'll run with it. I think that we were just this is entertaining and we will simply double down on it.
Love that. Okay, last question. For kind of a no coiner, crypto hater, someone's grandma, how would you explain Berachain to them?
I think the best way of putting it is that Berachain is really the first chain that can reward you simply for using it. And that's what we've been distilling or thinking about a lot over time, trying to find a way to position that doesn't sound like scammy / oh, it's too good to be true. But it's simply the fact that if you're engaging with an application on Berachain and conducting your day-to-day activities, whether that's a game or a savings account or borrowing and lending or whatever you might be doing, that's something that can be earning you rewards in the form of BGT or other incentives. And I think that's a fairly powerful concept that does not exist in most cases. There's also the other angle, which is you can go to Cardano mode and be like, Berachain's the first chain powered by Proof of Liquidity, and throw it back to 2017 and hope that people find that cool. But I think I err more towards the former than the latter.
I like that. So in conclusion, a chain that rewards you for using it and the community, likes to have fun while maintaining competence. I think we can finish with that. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate the in-depth answers to all the questions. And I'll leave with this. If you enjoyed what you listened to today, please subscribe to our channel and leave a review for today's episode. Until next time, I'm Nick Carey, and on behalf of the entire Blockchain.com team, thank you for tuning in.